One moment you're laughing with your best friend about a promotion, and the next, you're staring at the cold steel of handcuffs. The air smells like rain and asphalt. A bag of white powder appears out of nowhere in your glove compartment. You know you're innocent, but the badge staring back at you doesn't care. In a city where the law is often bought and sold, two young men are about to become statistics in a system designed to crush them. But they didn't count on one thing: a lawyer who treats the truth like a weapon. Welcome to the story of a frame-up that went wrong. Part 1. The setup, the inciting incident, the neon lights of South Central flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the brick walls. Marcus and DeAndre were sitting in a 2018 Honda Civic, the bass of their music barely audible over the hum of the cooling fan. It was a Friday night, a night for celebration. Marcus had just landed a position at a prestigious logistics firm, his ticket out of the neighborhood. "We finally made it, bro," DeAndre said, leaning back. "No more looking over our shoulders." Before Marcus could answer, the world turned blue and red. A patrol cruiser slammed to a halt behind them, blocking the narrow alleyway. The blinding beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, forcing them to shield their eyes. "Step out of the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." The voice was gravelly, authoritative, and dripping with malice. Officer Miller and his partner, Officer Holloway, were legends in the district, not for their heroism, but for their clearance rates. As Marcus and DeAndre stepped out, their hearts pounding against their ribs, they knew the script. They had seen it happen to their neighbors. They stayed calm, kept their hands visible, and complied. "Random check," Holloway muttered, his eyes darting towards the car. Marcus watched, horrified, as Holloway slipped his hand into the glove compartment, a compartment they both knew was empty. When he pulled his hand out, he held a plastic baggie. "Well, look at this. Looks like we have a stash here. Enough to put you boys away for a decade." The transition from freedom to handcuffs was a blur of violence and shouted slurs. They were being framed, not by fate, but by those sworn to protect the peace. Elias Thorne's office was located in the heart of downtown, a sprawling space that felt more like a fortress than a law firm. He was a man of contrasts, sharp-edged suits and a soft-spoken demeanor that could silence a courtroom in a heartbeat. He spent his mornings analyzing case files with the intensity of a surgeon, and his afternoons dissecting the failures of the judicial system. When Marcus's mother sat across from him, her hands trembling as she described the discovery of the drugs in the glove box, Thorne didn't interrupt. He listened, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, searching for the crack in the facade of this particular injustice. "They aren't just bad apples, Mrs. Williams," Thorne said once she finished, his voice steady. "They are the harvesters. They plant the seeds of criminality in innocent lives to reap the rewards of conviction quotas. I've had my eyes on Miller and Holloway for a long time. They operate under a veneer of efficiency, but their trail is riddled with procedural irregularities that they think are hidden beneath layers of paperwork." He took the case immediately, not because he needed the fee, but because the stench of the frame-up was undeniable. That night Thorne didn't go home. He pulled up the digital archives of Miller and Holloway's recent arrests. He began a forensic audit of every single arrest they had made in the last 2 years. He discovered a pattern that made his blood run cold. In 32 separate instances, the arresting officers had reported finding narcotics in vehicles during routine traffic stops. In every single one of those cases, the suspects were young men of color. Every single one. And every single time, the drugs were found in areas of the vehicle that were impossible for the occupants to reach without prior knowledge. Thorne realized that he couldn't win this by playing the game. He had to dismantle the board. He reached out to a contact he had within the department, a veteran detective named Sarah Jenkins, who had been ostracized for refusing to play along with the precinct's innovative policing tactics. They met in a dimly lit diner, the kind of place where conversations were protected by the hum of the refrigerator. Their untouchable, Elias, Jenkins whispered, sliding a thick envelope across the Formica table. Miller and Holloway have friends in high places, captains who care more about numbers than integrity. But look at this. It's the dispatch logs from that night. Look at the timestamp on the traffic stop. Thorne opened the file, his eyes widening. They were 5 blocks away from the scene less than 30 seconds before they initiated the stop. Exactly, Jenkins leaned in. They didn't pull them over for a broken taillight or a rolling stop. They were hunting. They saw the car, they saw the demographic, and they decided the outcome before they even turned on their lights. But that wasn't enough. A traffic stop timing anomaly could be dismissed as a coincidence, or a minor error. Thorne needed proof of the plant. He needed to show that the drugs didn't belong to Marcus or DeAndre. He needed to find the source of the substances themselves. He spent the next 48 hours tracing the chain of custody for the seized drugs. He found that the evidence bags in Marcus's case had been processed through a secondary laboratory, one that was notoriously underfunded and operated by a civilian technician who had been fired from 3 previous positions for incompetence. Thorne then turned to the most overlooked source of evidence: the city's smart grid surveillance. Los Angeles was covered in cameras. He hired a private digital investigator to pull the high-resolution feed from the intersection where the stop occurred. He needed to see if the officers had been in contact with any confidential informants, or if they had retrieved anything from their own trunk before approaching the Honda Civic. The footage came back on a rainy Tuesday morning. Thorne sat alone in his office, his finger hovering over the playback button. He hit play. There, in the grainy, high-contrast black and white, was the moment. Holloway had reached into the patrol car's trunk before walking toward the boys. He had pulled out a small, clear object, tucked it into his heavy-duty jacket pocket, and then adjusted his holster as he stepped toward the Civic. It wasn't a smoking gun, it was a nuclear device for his defense. Thorne leaned back in his chair, a grim smile touching his lips. He finally had them. The officers thought they were dealing with 2 scared kids who would take a plea deal to avoid the agony of a trial. They didn't know they were fighting a man who had waited 10 years for an opportunity to turn their own tactics against them. The stage was set. The investigation had moved from a desperate scramble to a calculated strike. Thorne began preparing his discovery motions, knowing that when he dropped this evidence into the hands of the prosecutor, the entire case against Marcus and DeAndre wouldn't just crumble, it would implode. With the surveillance footage secured, Elias Thorne knew he held the key to the castle, but he also knew that in the world of high-stakes criminal defense, a key is useless if the locks are rigged. Thorne realized that Miller and Holloway were not operating in a vacuum. To ensure they couldn't simply destroy the evidence, or intimidate the witnesses, he had to build a narrative that transcended just one traffic stop. He needed to prove that the drugs found in the Honda Civic were part of a larger inventory of illegally obtained contraband used by the officers to manipulate their statistics. Thorne turned his focus to the Galactic Shawarma shop, a curious, local hangout spot near the scene of the arrest. While the shop was known for its eclectic menu, Thorne had noticed something unusual in the background of several police dashcam videos he had subpoenaed. The same unmarked gray sedan was parked near that shop on multiple occasions when Miller and Holloway were on duty. He dispatched a private investigator, a former journalist named Elena Vance, to dig deeper into the shop's history. Under the guise of a food blogger researching hidden gems, Elena spent a week embedded in the neighborhood. She discovered that the owner of the shop was a man named Mr. Henderson, who had been under immense pressure from the local precinct to provide insider information on neighborhood youth. Henderson had been terrified of losing his business license and had been coerced into keeping a locked drawer in his office accessible to Miller and Holloway. Thorne's plan was simple yet dangerous. He needed to get into that office. On a rain-slicked Thursday evening, Thorne and Elena executed their move. While Elena kept a lookout, Thorne used a sophisticated lockpicking set, a skill he had learned from an old client in a previous life, to gain entry to the shop's back office. The air inside was heavy with the smell of spices and old grease. He didn't have much time. He scanned the office, bypassing the registers and focusing on the heavy, wooden desk in the corner. He found the drawer, and it wasn't empty. It contained a ledger, a handwritten record of every drop-off the officers had made, meticulously dated and timed. Beside the ledger were several small, vacuum-sealed bags of synthetic substances, identical in packaging to what had been found in Marcus's car. "I've got it," Thorne whispered into his comms, his heart racing. As he packed the evidence into his briefcase, he heard the faint sound of sirens, not far off, but approaching. Miller and Holloway were on a routine patrol in the area. Thorne realized they were about to be caught in the act. He didn't panic, he moved with the precision of a ghost. He exited through the fire escape, sliding down the metal stairs just as a patrol cruiser rounded the corner, its searchlight sweeping across the front of the shop. Back in his office, Thorne spent the entire night cross-referencing the ledger with the official arrest reports. The correlation was absolute. The officers were using Henderson's shop as a staging ground, storing the drugs there to ensure they had a fresh supply whenever they needed to boost their arrest numbers. Thorne had gone from having a piece of surveillance footage to possessing the entire blueprint of their corruption. He now had the ledger, the video evidence, and most importantly, he was close to securing a statement from Mr. Henderson, who had finally reached his breaking point. The defense was no longer just about Marcus and DeAndre, it was becoming a full-scale assault on the integrity of the local precinct. Thorne sat in his chair, the morning sun beginning to pierce through the blinds, casting light on the stacks of documents that would soon bring two powerful men to their knees. He pulled out his phone and made one final call. "Detective Jenkins," he said as soon as she answered. "I have everything. It's time to move." The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the scent of floor wax and nervous anticipation. Marcus and DeAndre sat at the defense table, their faces pale, watching the doors as Elias Thorne walked in. He didn't look like a man about to destroy two police officers' careers, he looked like a man who was merely completing a scheduled task. Officer Miller and Officer Holloway sat in the back, leaning back in their chairs, their smirks suggesting they still believed the system would protect them. They didn't see the man in the charcoal suit sitting behind them, a representative from the Internal Affairs Bureau that Thorne had personally invited to witness the proceedings. The prosecution opened with a rehearsed, sterile presentation, painting Marcus and DeAndre as opportunistic dealers caught red-handed. The judge, a stern man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, allowed the testimony to continue, but his eyes kept drifting toward Thorne. He knew that when Thorne was this quiet, a storm was brewing. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice low and resonant, "the prosecution's case rests entirely on the integrity of the officer's testimony. Let's examine that integrity." He called Officer Holloway to the stand. The officer swaggered forward, adjusting his badge as if it were a shield against scrutiny. Thorne started slow, asking about the routine of the patrol, the frequency of the stops, and the officer's personal protocols. Holloway grew confident, lying with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. Then, Thorne struck. He projected the high-resolution surveillance footage onto the courtroom's massive screen. The room fell deathly silent as the video played. The moment Holloway reached into the trunk, the slight hesitation, the tucking of the object into his jacket. "Officer Holloway," Thorne's voice cut through the room like a blade, "was there a reason you needed to retrieve an item from your trunk 30 seconds before you initiated this routine traffic stop?" Holloway stumbled, his face turning a shade of pale that clashed with his uniform. I was checking my gear. Standard procedure. Standard procedure to secure contraband before a stop." Thorne stepped closer, towering over the witness. "And how do you explain the ledger found in the office of Mr. Henderson, detailing your inventory of synthetic substances?" The prosecutor jumped to his feet, objecting frantically. But the judge overruled him, his eyes now locked on the evidence displayed on the screen. The confidence of the officers in the back of the room evaporated. Miller stood up, attempting to exit the courtroom, but two bailiffs, acting on direct orders from the internal affairs agent Thorne had brought, stepped into his path. Thorne didn't stop there. He brought in Mr. Henderson. The shop owner, terrified but finally shielded by the court, testified about the coercion, the locked drawer, and the donations he had been forced to accept to keep the officers from planting evidence on his own patrons. By the time Thorne finished his cross-examination, the courtroom was a whirlwind of motion. The judge was visibly shaken, his face etched with a mix of fury and disappointment. The narrative had shifted entirely. The victims were now the heroes, and the predators were the ones under the spotlight, their masks of authority stripped away to reveal the corruption beneath. The jury, a group of ordinary citizens who had walked in expecting to convict two young men, now looked at the officers with naked disgust. Thorne sat down, smoothed his suit, and watched as the defense attorney's ultimate goal was realized. He hadn't just proven his clients were innocent, he had exposed the rot that fed on the city. The aftermath of the trial was a seismic event that shook the city to its foundations. As the gavel fell for the final time, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed from the stifling tension of a legal battle into the electric hum of overdue justice. Marcus and DeAndre, who only days before had been facing the systematic erasure of their futures, stood free, their names cleared of every false accusation. The judge did not mince words when delivering the verdict. He characterized the actions of Miller and Holloway not merely as police misconduct, but as a calculated assault on the sanctity of the law itself. The badge is not a license to prey upon the vulnerable, the judge declared, his voice echoing through the silent hall. It is a heavy responsibility that you have betrayed with every action recorded in this trial. Officer Miller and Officer Holloway were taken into custody immediately, the very handcuffs they had once used to entrap the innocent now biting into their own wrists. The irony was not lost on the courtroom gallery. They were led out through the same doors they had entered, but their posture was broken, their arrogance replaced by the hollow realization that their careers, their reputations, and their freedom had been obliterated. Outside the courthouse, a sea of cameras and reporters waited. Elias Thorne stepped onto the courthouse steps, flanked by Marcus and DeAndre. He didn't offer a triumphant speech or a gloating smile. Instead, he looked directly into the camera lens with the steady gaze of a man who understood that this was only one battle in a much larger war. Today, the law worked, Thorne said, his voice carrying clearly over the roar of the crowd. But justice should not be a victory reserved for those who can afford to fight for it. We have exposed two individuals, but we have highlighted a culture that allowed them to flourish. The work does not end here. For Marcus and DeAndre, the road ahead was one of healing. They had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side, forever changed by the realization that while the system could be weaponized against them, it could also be held accountable when challenged by the truth. They returned to their neighborhood, not as victims, but as symbols of resilience. Mr. Henderson's shop, once a site of coercion, became a symbol of neighborhood liberation, eventually closing its doors to start anew, free from the shadow of the precinct's corruption. Detective Sarah Jenkins, whose courage had provided the final link in Thorne's investigation, received a commendation for her integrity, marking a slow but necessary shift within the department's ranks. The city continued to bustle, the neon lights of South Central still flickered, but the streets felt slightly different. The myth of the untouchable officer had been shattered. Elias Thorne returned to his office, the quiet sanctuary of his books and his files. He knew that tomorrow there would be another case, another person caught in the machinery of injustice, and he would be ready. The story of Marcus and DeAndre became a cautionary tale for those who believed they could hide behind a shield while betraying their oath, a reminder that in the shadow of the law, the truth eventually finds a way into the light.